Science of the University of Buenos Aires. The conference Rethinking the Interplay between Morality and Law in the 21st Century will take place. In this event, we will have the opportunity to hear the valuable contribution of two speakers who will verse in the subject. The conference will be broadcasted on various digital platforms where the audience can listen and ask questions that will later be addressed to the speakers. Firstly, we will the participation of Dr. Nigel Simmonds. He's Emeritus Professor of Jurisprudence at the University of Cambridge and past University Dean at Corpus Christi College at the University of Cambridge, United Kingdom. His books include a debate over rights, central use and in jurisprudence, and law as a moral idea. We thought to Professor Nigel Simmonds is one of the most brilliant minds in the philosophy of law in the contemporary world. We will also have the participation of Luis David Zambrano, current professor and director of the Culture for Peace and Human Rights course at the Faculty of Social Science of UBA. He's the author of numerous books and articles related to legal theory, constitutional law, labor law, human rights, education law, and culture. He currently works alongside Adolphe Esquivel, Nobel Peace Prize laureate, in seeking a peaceful and democratic solution to the various political and educational challenges of the modern world. I would like to point out that Professor Nigel Simmonds, we will have approximately 30 minutes to present the insightful contribution on the subject, and the Luis David Fernández Zambrano will have a suitable time to make his relevant contribution on the subject. Dear Professor Nigel Simmonds, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. You're really too kind, and I'm very pleased you've invited me to speak in your university this afternoon. I hope the internet holds up so that you can at least hear what I'm saying. Okay, well, I'm going to start with what is really, in some ways, the fundamental problem of the philosophy of law. And it's a problem of an infinite regress, as so many philosophical problems are. In the ordinary practice of law and legal argument, we obviously make references to the law, and our references often rest on certain assumptions about law's nature. And yet, when in a reflective hour we try to combine those various assumptions, we often find that they can't easily form any coherent abstract object. So the infinite regress that I have in mind starts from a couple of obvious assumptions, and then it shows that we can't easily reconcile those two assumptions. First is an assumption along the lines of saying that all laws are created by human acts or human decisions. And on the other hand is an assumption along the lines that human acts or human decisions can create law only if they're legally authorized so to do. So I can't create law for you, for the very simple reason that there is no law authorizing my creation of law. So here we have, it would seem, an infinite regress. Every law is created by some human act or human decision, and yet the act in question is only able to create law if and insofar as it is authorized by some higher law. And since every law is created by a human act, the higher law must also be created by a human act, which must in turn be authorized by another law. So you have an infinite regress. And a great deal of the history of philosophy of law is really an attempt at blocking that infinite regress. And there are two main ways of doing it. They're not the only ways of attempting it, yet they are by far the most common and influential ways. On the one hand, you have the idea that the regress can only be blocked by grounding law in morality. And a very good illustration of this is Kant. You know, Kant says that you can certainly imagine a system of wholly posited laws where every law is created by some human act. Yet even such a system must contain at least one natural law in the form of a fundamental law authorizing the supreme lawmaker. And Kant says that fundamental law is the basis for any possible giving of positive law. And it consists in the sum of the conditions under which the choice of one can be united with the choice of another. So the human condition is such that human choices conflict. However, there is some way, apparently, Kant thinks, of reconciling choices so that my choices may be compatible with the choices of other people. The sum of the conditions under which my choices may be compatible with the choices of others, they form the basic natural law, which itself provides the only possible basis for any giving of positive law. Now, sometimes people read Kant as if he has in mind some set of abstract principles that you could work out by reason, and they therefore think that he's really offering a theory about what law ought to be, a theory in effect about justice, about the values law should pursue, rather than a theory about what law in itself is. But I think that's wrong. When he speaks of the sum of the conditions under which choices can be reconciled or conjoined with each other, he has in mind the intervention of the lawmaker. He has in mind the enactment of positive laws. So the conditions under which choices can be reconciled for Kant are created by the enactment of positive laws. So this is very much a theory about the moral basis of positive law. And therefore it is an answer, and I think a pretty good answer, to our initial problem about the infinite regress. However, in the modern world, answers of this sort, answers grounding law in morality, are for some really not very good reasons unpopular. And the vast majority of legal theorists for a long time have been self-styled legal positivists, in the sense that they don't think law has any necessary foundation in morality at all. They think that law fundamentally boils down to a form in which power can be exercised. And this, I think, is very clear in the work of Hart. I could take Kelson, who speaks of the Gorgon's head of power, which you will see if you look, just beyond the surface of law. But I'm much more happy talking about Hart, so that's what I'll do. Hart, sometimes when you say that Hart is presenting laws grounded in power, you find people resisting that claim. They say, surely Hart makes a distinction in between law and what he calls a gunman situation. And that distinction is very important for Hart. But when Hart makes that distinction, he's not contrasting law and the gunman situation. in some sort of morally significant way. Indeed, his argument really is that law differs from the gunman situation only in the rule-based form that it has. And it's that rule-based form which gives it an appearance that is fundamentally different from the gunman situation. And that appearance leads many people into thinking that the law has some sort of moral halo, some sort of necessary moral basis. However, it's Hart's whole point that ultimately law just boils down to the exercise of power. Incidentally, when I speak of power here, I don't necessarily mean coercion. I simply mean the ability of a regime to gain the sort of control over the conduct of the population, which is involved in securing their compliance with your enactments by and large. So if the bulk of the population generally comply with your enactments, you've got power in the relevant sense. And the question of why they're complying is an entirely separate question. They may be complying out of fear of coercion, or it may be that they think you're a very good and a very just regime and they're happy to comply for that reason. Whatever the reason for the compliance, it's the ability of the regime to secure that compliance which enables them to make law in the first place. Okay, now this kind of approach, this kind of legal positivist approach, claiming that fundamentally law is simply a form in which power is exercised and it has no necessary or intrinsic moral basis. I mean, it may have a moral basis contingent on the circumstances and attitudes of that regime. However, it hasn't got any intrinsic moral basis inherent in its very status as law. That type of theory encounters a crunch problem when we think about the judicial judgment, as the judicial judgment invokes law as a justification for the judge's decision. And of course, the judge's decision may be ordering coercive sanctions against individuals. And even if it isn't, it's going to be making a very important impact upon the individuals in front of the court and maybe upon the whole community. And the justification classically invoked by the judge for his or her decision is a law. Some rule of law, some principles of law will be invoked as the critically important justification for the outcome. Now, a legal positivist theory, like any other theory of law, has to be capable of explaining how law can intelligibly be invoked as a justification for the judge's decision. A legal positivist needn't show that law actually does justify the judge's decision. However, they do have to show that it can at least intelligibly be offered as a justification. And even Hart would have to accept that. After all, if you think about it, it's on precisely that ground that Hart rejects Austin's theory of obligation. John Austin had said that a legal obligation is simply the likelihood of suffering a sanction. And Hart says an analysis of legal obligation along those lines simply won't work, as the likelihood of suffering a sanction cannot intelligibly be invoked as a justification for imposing a sanction. It's just not the kind of thing which could conceivably serve as a justification. Now, although Hart raises that as an objection to Austin, in the concept of law, he never really sees how it could also be an objection to his own theory. After all, he tells us that the rule of recognition, this fundamental rule of the entire legal system, is simply a rule accepted by the officials. And those officials may accept that rule for all sorts of reasons, including, he says, reasons of self-interest. Their acceptance of the basic rule of recognition need not be based on any sort of moral considerations. It could be based on their own self-interest. Well, now, how can a judge invoke laws stemming from a basic rule of recognition that the judge has accepted solely for reasons of self-interest? How can such laws be invoked intelligibly as a justification for a decision which may impose a sanction on the individuals in front of the court? When Hart wrote the concept of law, he hadn't seen that that was a problem. He thought it was a problem for Austin, but he didn't think it was a problem for him. Later on, he comes to realize that it is a problem for his theory. And so in his later book, Essays on Bentham, he says that the legal justification offered by a judge is merely technical. It's merely confined. It consists only in the subsumption of the individual case under the legal rule. There is no assumption or assertion along the lines of saying that the application of that legal rule in this case is morally justifiable. It's a technical and confined justification. It's a bit, how Hart thinks of it, I think, is a bit like this, that if you and I choose to play a game and it's a game governed by rules, within the game, we just apply the rules because they're the rules of the game. Our reasons for playing the game may be very diverse. You may be playing in order to win some money. Maybe you're a professional in this game. I may be playing simply for fun. Our reasons for playing the game may be very diverse, yet the reasons obtaining within the game are all the same as they're technical and confined to the game. That basically is how Hart thinks about the reasons obtaining within law, including the justifications offered for the judge's judgment. Now, Raz, generally I don't agree with Raz about many things. In fact, almost everything he says I tend to disagree with. However, he's absolutely right about one thing. That argument of Hart's will not do, since the situation a judge is addressing is a situation of great seriousness for the individuals and possibly for the community more generally. And the judge's decision may involve very harsh consequences for some of those people. So the judge cannot approach this as simply a technical, confined matter where the moral issues can be set on one side. However, Raz deals with this point as follows. He says, judges must indeed be either assuming that the law is morally binding or pretending that they think the law is morally binding. Otherwise, their invocation of the law as a justification for their decision would not make any sense. So in this way, Raz says, the law, through its officials, i.e. the judges, the law is claiming that it obligates us. The law is itself claiming to place a moral obligation upon us. However, that claim need not be correct. And here we have why Raz thinks this thesis of his about law's moral claim is entirely compatible with being a legal positivist in the sense of denying law's intrinsic moral authority. Indeed, he argues that law cannot possibly have the sort of moral authority it claims, as it claims to bind everyone, all the citizens within its jurisdiction, it claims to bind. And that, Raz thinks, is impossible, since authority for him is a matter of increasing the capacity of an individual to comply with those reasons which bear on their conduct independently of the law. Okay, let's say that I have a reason for helping very poor people who are in need in let's say my own community. I have a reason independently of law for helping those very poor people. Well, the law helps me in complying with those reasons, since it takes money off me in taxation and it hands it out through the welfare state. It identifies the very poor people and it gives them a sum of money, some of which is out of my tax. So in this way, the law has a kind of moral authority over me when and if it assists me in complying with reasons I have independently of the law. However, okay, it's argued by Raz. However, that means that real moral authority is always piecemeal in character. The law may have authority over some individuals in some contexts and not over other individuals in other contexts. For example, I know nothing whatsoever about drugs. So if I wish to avoid, taking harmful drugs, it would be a good idea for me to follow the law, because the law will tend to prohibit harmful drugs and only allow the use of non-harmful drugs. So since I know nothing about drugs, and I have a good reason independently of law for avoiding harmful drugs, it would be a good idea for me to guide my conduct by the law. But if, on the other hand, I'm a leading expert on drugs, I may know much more about them than do the lawmakers who enacted these laws about drugs. So in Raz's view, the law wouldn't have any authority over me as an expert on drugs. This is what he means by law having a piecemeal authority over people. It depends on who the people are and on what the law is about. And the two main ways in which he thinks law has authority is one through expertise, the kind of example I've given you, and the other, its ability to coordinate conduct, which applies to certain really fairly specific categories of law. So law, in Raz's view, claims a universal authority, but it cannot possess any such authority. It claims an authority that it doesn't have, and therefore, in ascribing that moral claim to the law, he's not saying anything incompatible with legal positivism. Legal positivism still, in his view, maintains that law has no intrinsic moral authority, which is simply a consequence of its status as law. Its authority is always contingent on circumstances which vary from one situation to another. Okay. Now, the account of authority involved in Raz's argument is what he calls the service conception of authority, the idea that something gains authority when it offers me a service in helping me to comply more effectively with the reasons bearing on my conduct independently of law. Well, now, we could contest Raz's overall argument by contesting his service conception of authority. But let's not go down that route. We don't need to. Because it may be that there are certain goods that we have reason to pursue insofar as they are essential preconditions for anything we would regard as a fully flourishing human life. There are certain things you absolutely must have as essential preconditions before you could really hope to have a fully flourishing life. You could have a minimally acceptable life, but you couldn't have a fully flourishing life unless these preconditions are satisfied. And one of these preconditions is what I call freedom as independence, or freedom as independence from the power of another. This is the form of freedom which really distinguishes the free man or woman from the slave. And it's essentially different from the kind of freedom which consists in the number or the value or the extent of the options you have available. Some slaves, for example, if we think about ancient Rome, some slaves probably had a great many very valuable, very worthwhile options available to them, as some slaves were used in order to run really complex commercial enterprises. This was as a result of the fact that the slave could have a fund of money called a peculium, which was still technically owned by the master, yet it was administered by the slave. And so it served as a kind of analog or a substitute for the limited liability company. You entrust your slave with a fund of money, he trades with it, and you take a large slice or almost the entirety of the profit. However, in order to be running these big commercial enterprises, these high status slaves may have had many, many options available to them. Meanwhile, there could be free men who have to work very hard for a living, who are very poor, who have very few options. So the slave may, in some cases, have far more options and far better options than a free man. Yet the slave is still a slave, and the free man is still a free man. Where does the difference consist? The difference is in this. All of the slave's options, however valuable and attractive they may be, all of those options are entirely dependent upon the master's will. Whereas the free man may have very few and very restricted options, but they may be independent of anyone else's will. So freedom as independence is not at all the same sort of thing as freedom as having lots of options. It's a different sort of thing, but it's an incredibly important thing. It's what really distinguishes the free man from the slave. Now, the core of my argument in my book, Laws, a Moral Idea, is that insofar as you are governed by the rule of law, insofar as you're governed in accordance with the rule of law, you enjoy a degree of freedom as independence that you could not enjoy in any other way. And by the rule of law, I mean a high degree of compliance with the 8 precepts that are put forward by Lon Fuller in his book, The Morality of Law. If you are governed under a regime which complies to a high degree with Fuller's 8 precepts, then you will enjoy a degree of not complete freedom as independence. There's no such thing while you're living in a human community. You will, however, enjoy a degree of freedom as independence which you could not possibly enjoy in any other way. At one point in my book, I talk about a hypothetical village community. Okay. I'm doing some speculative anthropology, if you like, rather similar to Hart's, the primary, the world without any secondary rules, which has only primary rules, which Hart talks about in the concept of law. I talk about a village community which has certain customary practices and rules, and yet when a dispute occurs about the interpretation and application of those rules, it's not resolved by anything like a court of law in our sense. It's not a matter of offering a definite interpretation of each rule and then enforcing that interpretation. Every dispute in my hypothetical village community is settled by amicable compromise. Pressure is placed on the two disputing parties in order to force them to make some sort of compromise. And I explain in my book why village communities might do that, and why in many ways it might be an attractive idea. But if you live in a village community like that, you're completely subjected to the power of other people. The minute you start doing something that your neighbors don't like, they will object. And the minute they object, you know that you're heading for a situation where some compromise will be forced on you. It will be forced on you by the other members of your community. This is how many communities the world over, in fact, operate. And in many ways, it's an attractive way of life. But one thing it doesn't give you is freedom as independence from the power of another. That's something that you can only have under a regime of the strict enforcement of clearly articulated, published, prospective rules. And that is what Fuller is talking about. Now, a lot of legal positivists would say this. They'd say, okay, Nigel, we don't really disagree with that, but what you're talking about is the rule of law. And the rule of law is not the same thing as law. Law is a kind of social institution, whereas the rule of law is a moral ideal that is especially relevant to social institutions of that type. So sure, we agree with you that a rule of law is terrific, but that's a moral ideal which the social institution of law may or may not choose to pursue. That sort of argument is fundamentally at odds with Fuller's approach. Fuller, in his famous story about Rex and Rex's attempts at lawmaking, he tells us of 8 ways in which Rex fails to make law. His story is very entertaining and he's doing a lot of different things in that story, but he would have got his point across much more straightforwardly had he simply said something like this. Look, if you came across a system of government where there simply weren't any rules whatsoever, you wouldn't think that was a legal system, would you? Or if you came across a system of governance where there were rules, yet all of the rules were completely retrospective, you wouldn't think that was a legal system either. And so on through all of the 8. His story is really alerting us to 8 very settled understandings we have about what will and will not count as law. And those understandings, I think, are very settled. None of us would think that any of these, fairy tale situations where there are no rules at all or all the rules are retrospective, none of us would think that any of those are actually instances of law. Legal theorists, incidentally, often try to fudge this. So they try to say that Lon Fuller is talking about situations where the serious shortfall from full compliance. I mean, Dworkin is an instance of somebody who does this, where the serious shortfall of from the ideal of full compliance, and yet we would still think it's law, or we might think it's a debatable matter, and anyway, who cares? But that's not what Fuller's saying. Fuller is talking about instances where there are no rules at all, or they're all retrospective, or they're all impossible to comply with. or the officials never act in accordance with them, and none of us would regard any of those as instances of law. Yet the funny thing is, if you take those 8 settled understandings and you flip them around and you think of them as requirements for a legal system, requirements which a legal system may or may not comply with in full, you then realize that what you're talking about is the rule of law. So Fuller brings out so powerfully the intimate connection in between the idea of law and the idea of the rule of law. Okay, now I have got lots more to say, I should add, but I've been talking now, I think, for about half an hour. So I'll just briefly summarize by saying this. Raz thinks he can accept that in adjudication, the law is making a moral claim, a claim of moral authority over the citizens. And he thinks that he can render that compatible with legal positivism insofar as the claim is clearly false in Raz's view. Law cannot possibly have that sort of authority, the sort of authority it claims. Well, there are actually many things wrong with that argument, which I could go into. But I'm just focusing, I'm at present focusing on just one objection, which I think is the most powerful of all, which is actually there is something which is intrinsic to governance of law, intrinsic to being governed by law, which is a good for all of us, and a good which is an essential precondition of any fully flourishing human life. If you haven't got some options which are independent of the will of other people, you haven't got any ground on which you can stand and say, look, you may object, you may not like the things that I'm doing, but too bad, because I'm acting within the scope of my legal rights. And you can only do that where you are governed by law. And you can only have a fully flourishing life if there are at least some domains of your life, however reduced they may be, however small they may be, only if you've got some domains of your life where you can say that, are you capable of having a fully flourishing life. Okay, so I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you very much for such a great presentation, Doctor. And now I give the floor to the Dr. Luis Fernández Zambrano. You have the floor.
Okay.
Hello. Yeah. One moment, please. Okay. That's right. Hello. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a true honor to have the opportunity to share ideas and reflect alongside the Professor Nigel Simmonds on such fascinating topics within the philosophy of law. In this context, I hope to present some ideas that can enrich our reflections. Firstly, I would like to address the idea presented by Hart, Leonard Hart, who established that the reflection between morality and law is based on a relationship of contendency. That is to say, there are moments when morality and law converge, and others when they do not. For example, let's consider the laws that reflect a commitment to social welfare and grounding in both legal principle and principle of legitimacy. These laws by being in harmony with morality. strengthen social fabric and promotes justice. On the other hand, we can reflect on laws created by totalitarian regime, such those enacted by the Nazis. These laws completely lack a moral foundation committed to defending human life and fundamental rights. Instead, practicing and promoting the humanity, these laws serve authoritarian and destructive agendas. It is important to recognize that the relationship between morality and law is complex and variable. While some laws may reflect shared moral values, others may completely diverge from ethics. Therefore, is essential to critically analyze laws and legal system based on their coherence and with fundamental ethical principles and their contribution to the common good. In summary, in exploring the relationship between morality and law, we must recognize both their points and the convergence and their displays. This allows us not only to better understand the nature of law, but also to promote a legal order that truly serves justice and human dignity. For example, all of these leads to reflect from the perspective of Radbruch, suggests that law ceases to be law when it becomes extremely unjust. However, determining where a law is criminally unjust involves considering a series and complex issues. For example, how when can we, the world where we are facing an criminally unjust or just law, justice and injustice have multiple facets that we cannot uproot. The concept of justice has evolved over time, has being influenced by variability factors. Was the conception of justice the same for Plato, Aristotle, Adolf Hitler, el Papa de Pope, Marcus Tulio Cicero, Carlos Santiago Nino, Eugenio Bullion? Really, it was not, and there are multiple influences that determine these inferences. Each of them had their own interpretation and perspective of justice, influenced by their historical, cultural, political, and philosophical context. In the absence of widespread consensus of why is just or unjust, the question arises of how we can determine what should be considered just or justice. There are questions that we must address from various angles to seek precise and contextualized answer. It is evident that justice is a complex and dynamic concept. We can be interpreted differently and depending on the context and circumstances. Clear circumstances. Therefore, it's essential to analyze its particular situation with sensitivity and ethical rigor, considering the various perspectives and values at play in order to make informed decision about what is just and what is not in a given legal and social context. For example, in the same context, it is important to highlight the human decision and inherently motivated by beliefs about what is right or wrong. There are links to morality and immorality. From this perspective, there is connection between morality and the decision individuals make in the creation and acceptance of laws, depending on the context in which they find themselves. Consider, for example, decision to enact a law in Nazi Germany, for example, in history, versus in a society that absolutely respect human rights. In their first situation, decision would be influenced by an ideology that undermines the fundamental values on humanity while in second, respect for dignity and inner rights of each individual would be prioritized. Therefore, subjectivity and historicity are essential components to have a clear reference point when establishing a value judgment on these issues. It is necessary to recognize that moral interpretation can vary depending on the cultural, social, and historical context in which there are found, implying there is no absolute moral truth, but rather diverse and constantly evolving perspective. Ultimately, is crucial to consider these elements when formulating a conclusion about the relationship between morality and law. Recognize the influence to society and historicity allows us to better understand the complexity of these issues and to adopt a more informed and sensitive approach in making legal and ethical decisions. I believe that the fundamental relationship between morality and law is visible but highly dependent on the context in which it is found. As Ephraim the Ephesus also emphasizes, therefore, a sin is a crucial function on legal philosopher to identify each historical, political, and cultural context, in particular, and understand that each of them is composed of diverse components that distinguish from each their difference can be evident and temporary. For example, Nazi Germany in 1939 years versus resemble whatsoever to present day Germany from the perspective of human rights. Similarly, the moral criteria guiding the formulation of laws regulating religious freedom differ between the Islamic State and Argentina today in the new millennium. Therefore, and consider it of utmost relevance to approach the issue of the relationship between morality and law through various contextualized variables. However, I believe that the most elective debates on the matter will continue to focus on the principles that justify the existence of the universal and above of majority morality, which can be integrated as it keeps with the legislative intentions of parliaments in different countries around in the world. These debates, discussion are essential to find a balance between cultural diversity and universal values, thus ensuring a legal system that respects and promotes human rights and justice worldwide. Both in United States, in Argentina, Colombia, United Kingdom, we vehemently defend human rights, but we recognize that these are relative and must be considered from that perspective. For example, while the right to life is fundamental, we must also consider that this right may have a limitation, as in the case of the right to self-defense, and in many legislation, the right to cause harm or even take and life is permitted only in situation of self-defense. This relativity of human rights can generate controversy and debate around these details. It's important to know that I do not process absolute truth on these matters. On the contrary, this reflection laid the groundwork for Huntley exploring various forms of the reason that hell has other practical solutions in society, in the history, in the future. We thought losing sight of the particularity of each specific situation. A specific situation is very important for the learning and decision about in the STEM. And to achieve this, an interdisciplinary, deep, and the broad approach is essential to enrich our perspective and decision in this regard. I pause my reflections here for the moment, but I consider it's crucial to continue this dialogue and analysis of human rights from critical and reflective perspective, always seeking to promote justice and respect for the dignity of every individual in the shoes of society. It's very interesting today for me, reflection about about the relation in moral and legal in the new century. Thank you very much, please.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Can I respond? Have I got time to respond? Okay. Well, I mean, obviously questions about whether there is such a thing as moral truth or whether we're moral relativists and so on. Obviously, these are very important questions, but they're not questions I could possibly engage with this afternoon. I would just like to clarify the fundamental impetus of what I said in my lecture. I'm not talking about the law's justice. Laws can be just or unjust. I'm talking about a good which is necessarily provided by law whenever law complies to a high degree with Fuller's 8 precepts. It's the good of freedom as independence from the power of another. It's not the same thing as freedom generally, and it's certainly not the same thing as justice or the general goodness or wisdom of the law. You might say that it's a rather small thing, that it doesn't really matter. Well, it's a very specific thing, but it matters very much because it's what serves to distinguish the free man from the slave, and it's therefore a value which underpins our condemnation of slavery. So it's clearly a value that human civilization has in recent times, at least, attached a great deal of importance to, and I think rightly so. Now, there are, of course, many evil regimes around the world, and you mention the Nazi regime. I really don't think that the Nazi regime complied to anything like a high degree or even a minimally adequate degree with Fuller's 8 precepts. But of course, there could be unjust regimes which do comply with Fuller's 8 precepts. In my debate with Matthew Kramer, I was not arguing that evil regimes would find it impossible to comply with the requirements of the rule of law. My argument was that they would have no good reason for doing so, and they would have many advantages that they could gain by departing from the rule of law. My claim is that the rule of law is an ideal itself rooted in law as a social institution. The two things are conceptually connected in the way that I think Lon Fuller clearly demonstrates. And the rule of law provides us with a good which is an essential precondition for a fully flourishing human life, but it's a good which is different from other goods like, say, justice. So it's a very specific thing, but it's very tightly connected with governance by rules and therefore with the idea of law. It gives law its intrinsic moral authority. Now, let me just say that that moral authority is a presumptive moral authority. It can be outweighed by other considerations. And if we're talking about egregiously unjust regimes, then it almost certainly will be outweighed by those other considerations. And in fact, I sympathize strongly with Gustav Radbruch's view that really cases of extreme injustice shouldn't be viewed as instances of law at all. However, even setting Radbruch's formula on one side, the moral authority I'm claiming as intrinsic to law is merely presumptive, and one still has to look at whether the law is just or unjust, whether it's democratically enacted or undemocratic, whether it restricts people's freedom a great deal or not very much. Those are all very relevant questions that one has to look at, but you're looking at them in order to weigh them against law's presumptive moral authority. And it's that presumptive moral authority which is denied by legal positivists such as Raz, and which I'm trying to defend. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you, doctor.
That's right. Puedes empezar con las preguntas, pero yo voy a aprovechar las preguntas para poder responderle al profesor Simmonds.
Okay.
Fantástico. No, sí, porque está muy buena la cuestión de Radbruch. Radbruch is very interesting for the complex in the discussion about the moral right in the justice and injustice, extreme injustice and justice for the context today in the new millennium, in the history and intelligent, artificial, and physical quantics. So it all is very interesting for the reflection. Very spread about this. Por favor, ¿puedes empezar con las preguntas?
Okay, thank you for your presentation and opinion, Dr. Nigel Simmonds. And throughout their presentation, we have received some questions from students watching this live broadcast. I will mention the following to hear your opinions. How Can we balance the pursuit of individual justice with moral responsibility towards communities and the planet as a whole? And how do you believe the evolution of technology, such as artificial intelligence and biotechnology, will impact the interaction between morality and law in the future? Dr. Nigel Simmonds and Dr. Fernández Zambrano, you have the floor. Each of you will have 5 minutes to answer. First, Dr. Nigel Simon, the doctor has the use of the word. Dr. Nigel.
Okay, well, I should say, first of all, that my internet connection is breaking up a little bit, so I'm not sure I caught everything you said, but I'll have a shot at answering this question. One thing I agree with Habermas about is that in the modern world, I think law is becoming increasingly important, because although I'm not any sort of moral relativist or moral skeptic, I think that just as a matter of sociological fact, really communities do not have the strong and fairly rich moral consensus which they may have exhibited in the past. So there is greater moral pluralism in the straightforward sense of people disagreeing a lot more about moral issues. And in this way, the law has the potential of really becoming for us the principal expression of mutual civility. This, of course, will be really, to a certain extent, it will be dependent upon the regime actually being a democratic regime, so that people can feel they've had some say in the formulation of the law. But I think even independently of that, law has certain features which would recommend it as being seen as a kind of a public conscience, if you like, or a public expression of mutual civility. Law has to be articulated in the form of explicit rules. It has a tradition of informed juristic commentary and criticism. And the traditions of law in that way open it up to rational debate in a way which is often not characteristic of ordinary moral argument. I mean, Leo Strauss, at one point in his work, says that liberal society, it becomes what he calls a seminary of intolerance. And his argument is that liberal society encourages the idea that really moral opinions are expressions of one's subjectivity, and therefore it attaches importance to the intensity with which people express their opinions. So the more intolerant you are, the more intensely you express your opinions, the more weight your opinions are given. So in this way, he says, liberalism is becoming a seminary of intolerance. It's an argument which I think has some force, but I think it's an argument which we should worry about. And the law gives us a way of resisting it, because the law is strongly rooted in traditions of rational argument and not of expressions of feeling and intensity. So I think that's about all I could say on that issue. I will actually, I'm looking at my clock, I will actually have to go, fairly soon, but okay.
Okay,
Well, that's
thank you.
right. It's very important for your opinion about. Well, I thinking um, is this respect um, balancing the pursuit in individual justice with moral responsibility towards community and the planet as a whole reiterates and integrate approach that recognize the interconnectedness of this aspect. Why it is crucial to protect and promote rights and justice for each individual, we must also consider the impact of our actions on their community and the environment. And this entails not only considering the immediate consequences of our decision, but also anti-self-painting and mitigating potential long-term negative effects. To achieve this balance, it is necessary to foster a culture of ethical responsibility that acknowledge our interdependence with other and with the natural environment. This may involve implementing policies and practice that promote sustainability, equity, and collective well-being while ensuring the protection of individual rights. Additionally, it is crucial to promote education and public awareness on these issues to that people can make informed and ethical decisions in their daily lives. Discussion in the society with the participation of the people, rich and poor, with and no with, is very important for the construction or building idea very complex disrespect. Ultimately, balancing the pursuit of individual justice with moral responsibility toward communities and the planning requires a holistic approach that takes into account both of needs and aspirations of individuals and the welfare of society as whole and the environment in which we live. The evolution of the technology, including artificial intelligence biotechnology, poses significantly ethical and legal challenges in the interaction between morality and law in the future. And today, right now, on one hand, this technological have the potential to improve knowledge of life and solve the complex problem in areas such as health, the environments, and society. And however, they also raise ethical dilemmas in terms of privacy, algorithmic discrimination, and the impact on the employment and human autonomy. In this regard, it is crucial for the legal and ethical framework to adapt and evolve outside technology to ensure that it is used responsibly and for the benefit of society as a whole. This may involve implementing regulation that protect individual rights and promotes fairness and transparency in the development and use of technology. Additionally, it is important to foster interdisciplinary dialogue. It's very important today in the new millennium. And collaboration among the experts in ethics of technology and philosophy and rights and medical and chemical and other relevant fields to address the challenges, the comprehensivity, and the thoughtfully. And in summary, while the evolution of technology present excites in the opportunity, it also requires the careful reflection on how to ensure that is used ethically and in harmony with fundamental principles to justice and respect of human rights. And this entails a practical and collaborative approach that intelligent multiple stakeholders in the policy-making and decision-making to guide the development and use of technology in the future. I'm firmly bigly in the concept of the real relativity when it comes on or directly comes to morality and law, understanding that this notion can vary significantly across time and space. Ronald working assertion about the evolving nature of concept resonates deeply with me. Emphasizing the need to adapt an understanding of morality and law to reflect contemporary realities. Moreover, Bradford's theory of the injustice adds another layer of complexity of this discussion. Radcliffe famously argued that there are certain laws of injustice that they cease to be laws altogether. This principle highlights the inherent tension between legal positivism and natural law, suggesting that there are moral principles that supersede any legal framework in today's world, where the rapid advancement of the technological and the globalization of the society have created real ethical dilemmas. The Radcliffe theory hence ignores relevance. Consider the ethical implication of artificial intelligence and quantum physics, where their boundaries between morality and legality become increasingly blurred. As we confront issues such as algorithmics bias, data privacy, and ethical implication on biotechnology, Radcliffe theory reminds of the importance of questioning the legitimacy of laws that violate fundamental moral principles. In essential, Radcliffe theory of injustice serves as the powerful reminder that the law must ultimately serve the interests of justice and human dignity. By incorporating new insights from fields such as quantum physics and artificial intelligence, we can better navigate the complexities of modern ethical dilemmas and ensure that our legal system remain just and equitable for all. Thank you.
Look, I'm afraid I am going to have to go now. I'm sorry if I misunderstood. I thought we were ending at about 5 o'clock, but I absolutely must go now. So it's been very kind of you to ask me to speak this afternoon, and I very much enjoyed it. I hope you did too. Okay. Okay, so bye.
Okay, thank you, professors.
Thank you.
We have...
Okay,
that's right. Well, creo que voy a empezar a acabar y bueno, acá acaba todo.